Good morning.
Hey, I started in this is it.
Good morning. Today is Thursday, March 2nd, 2023. It's 9 a.m. and we are reconvening to hear testimony on Bill S-100, also known as the Housing Bill. And our first guest this morning is Mr. Weiss. We have roughly an hour, so I'm going to ask guests to try to aim for testimony of around 10, 12 minutes. Then there'll be a little time for question and answer. And then I'll just see everyone in an orderly way. And keep my eye on the clock. That's all. Thank you for coming back this morning. I know we ran short of time yesterday.
Well, you're very welcome. Good morning. I'm Thomas Weiss. I'm a civil engineer, and my experience includes understanding contracts, regulations, and laws, water and sewer systems, flood studies, permitting, and environmental reviews. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. And I remind you, I am one of the few witnesses who is not paid to sit in this chair. Housing does not and cannot stand alone. Sustainable, affordable housing needs to be integrated with food security, child care, natural resources, energy, and more. And S-100 is not well integrated with reducing energy or protecting natural resources. Now, I'll be speaking from the written testimony that was put on your internet site for yesterday. What I am saying will be much abbreviated because that's a very long letter. So if any of you want to follow along now, or I encourage you to look up things later, because I put a lot more detail into that later as to why I come up with and how I come up with some of my conclusions. And I think S-100 is not well integrated with reducing energy or protecting natural resources. And something that's not in my letter is wastewater infrastructure earned the worst grade, a D+ on the 2023 report card of Vermont's infrastructure that was released 2 weeks ago. It also earned a D+ on the previous report card issued in 2019. No improvements over 4 years, and the D+ was the lowest grade of all the 9 categories that were rated. Yet S-100 is all about putting more sewage into our D+ infrastructure without making sure that the infrastructure can handle the additional flows. I believe there are still 14 municipalities with combined sewer systems, and adding housing will increase water pollution to those systems, will increase water pollution by increasing the frequency, duration, and volume of combined sewer overflows. If you have more sewage in the pipe, it takes less stormwater to raise the level in the pipes to the overflow point. So that's why I come to that. So I think this is an example of sacrificing our natural resources in the quest for more housing. And I would suggest a first priority in wastewater funding needs to be given to eliminating combined sewer overflows and to fixing up other systems that are really old and need some repairs. And this bill and the thermal loads bill, S-5, which you'll be presenting on the floor this afternoon, I believe, appear to be in direct conflict with each other. S-100 calls for building lots of new housing without considering the thermal loads. And S-5 considers thermal loads without considering whether the goals of that bill are achievable with such a large amount of new housing. And my letter, as I said, my letter expands in the abbreviated comments. So now getting into basically the contents of the letter. My first recommendation is to expand Act 250 jurisdiction outside Chapter 76A designations. Those are all the downtowns and neighborhood development areas and the other 3. One goal of Chapter 117 is to plan development so as to maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact villages and urban centers separated by rural countryside. And S-100, as you're aware, plans more housing in our compact centers and fails to reduce pressures on farms, forests, and the natural environment. This imbalance appears to be based on misguided assumption that increasing housing in the compact centers will automatically end pressure built in rural countryside. Even if 30,000 of the hoped for 40,000 units in the next 7 years go into the compact centers, that still leaves 10,000 a year for the rural countryside. Now, I don't know the split 30-10, but 30,000 seems like an awful lot to compact centers. And still going to be a lot of people who want to live out in the rural countryside. So, as I said, please expand the jurisdiction. Second, we need to speed up some already behind schedule. 2, prevent isolation zones of water and sewer systems from encroaching on a neighbor's property. S100 proposes twofers in all areas where zoning allows housing. I missed the first part of Representative Baumgart's testimony yesterday, and I don't know if he used the word twofer or not in explaining his requirement 2 units for each parcel. So there's no twofer for on-site wastewater system. On-site wastewater systems with 2 units need more land for the systems. They have larger isolation zones that cost more money. So these zones may encroach on a neighbor's property, restricting the neighbor's use of land in the zone. And the neighbor is not compensated for the restriction and cannot prevent the encroachment. If the neighbor builds a cellar in the isolation zone, there is a potential for leachate entering the cellar. Roots of vegetables and fruit trees in an isolation zone can extend into the leachate. And when a system fails, the neighbor could bear the brunt of surfacing sewage. So a trade-off for higher density in the rural countryside is preventing isolation zones from encroaching on neighbors. Third, remove the concept of enhanced designations. They were approved in the bill that came to you only 2 days before the committee voted. It's not ready to go, and there was insufficient time to provide meaningful testimony for the committee to react and revise. And if you're going to vote the bill out today or tomorrow, I doubt that you'll have time to react and revise. But the Natural Resources Board, under that proposal, will be required to develop model bylaws and act on applications for enhanced designations. Yet minutes of the board show that the members do not appear to be engaged with Act 250 in a meaningful way. They make no presentations. The meeting time is 17 minutes. And members of the board are political appointees of the current governor, a governor whose actions show a lack of support for Act 250. And the experience, expertise, or skills relating to the environmental land use of the board members appear mostly to be with the development side of environmental land use. And this is troubling for the creation of unbiased model laws. And I've got some attachments at the end of my letter that provide a summary of the minutes and a listing of the qualifications of the various board members. Provide access to sunlight for gardens. Housing should integrate sustainability and food security. Each lot should have space for gardening with access to sunlight. The gardening space should be large enough to allow residents to grow a significant portion of their own fruits and vegetables if they choose. The new lots and new construction need to preserve access to sunlight on their lots and neighboring lots. Fifth, amend the definition of area served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure. The definition seems to be running roughshod over good planning by negating good planning. And I acknowledge that this is different than what Charlie Baker said yesterday. It's kind of like too many negatives in one sentence. And I have taken out all the intervening material, starting to notwithstanding the 4412 and going down to all the various areas that he claimed were excluded. But the way I read it is they are all included. So that the extension to the mobile home park, that is what's the word term, area served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure, the way I read that. So I ask you to look at it carefully and figure out whether you, I think those areas should be excluded as Charlie Baker thought, but I don't think that's what the draft says. It says they are included. And so I have in my testimony the, as I said, taking out all the intervening stuff. So it's just that, this is what it says. I think it's like too many negatives in one sentence, what does it really mean? So, 6, retain existing Act 250 jurisdiction over housing projects. The demand for housing, 40,000 units in 7 years, will require permitting that is comprehensive and robust. Other permits collectively are neither comprehensive nor robust. For example, zoning is not required to include any of the 250 criteria. And a few were mentioned that a bylaw may include. The legislature in 2022 required the Natural Resources Board to report on location-based jurisdiction at the end of this year. The changes proposed in S100 will foreclose options that the evaluation might consider. How long does it take to get an Act 250 permit? That's not the relevant question. The relevant question is how much time is saved if the project is exempt from Act 250? And I did a study on that. I've got more information in my letter, but it doesn't save very much time because, as was said yesterday, Act 250 is required by its very nature to wait for all the permits to come in. So by the time the last permit comes in, Act 250 usually issues the permit within 6 days, something like that. So it's the other permits taking a long time that gives Act 250 a bad reputation because they get permits applied for early and then have to wait for all these other permits to come in to see whether, because the applicants use those other permits as part of their support of why it doesn't have undue adverse effects on various criteria. 7, and I'm not asking you to expand the jurisdiction over housing projects, just leave it the way it is now, take them out of them. 7, retain state oversight over connections to municipal water and wastewater systems. Eliminating wastewater system and potable water supply permits typically will not shorten the permitting period. It will not make housing affordable. And the permits are not redundant. They do provide value. I did an investigation. There's a link in my letter to where it's on this committee's site from last year. And those permits have found that the state review has found errors in allocations and design that were easy to correct during the permit review stage and would have been hard to correct when they were discovered in the field. And municipalities already have a procedure to issue the municipal water and wastewater system. So we don't need more procedures, let them use the one they've got. 8, retain the right of 10 persons to appeal decisions of the administrative officer and require public notice for certain decisions of the administrative officer, particularly that on enforcement. And you heard a little bit on that yesterday. The only decisions of an administrative officer that require public notice are permits issued by the officer. So if 10 persons or other people will include changing that somewhat to allow some appeals, but not necessarily any 10 persons for property owners in the town, are disturbed enough about the official decision, they should retain the ability to appeal. 9, require bylaws to define the character of the area in districts or portions of districts. Instead of prohibiting appeals based on the character of the area, I suggest requiring zoning bylaws to define the character of each area, and Montpelier's bylaws have such definitions. Then require the DRB to refer to that definition when writing its decision. Having a written definition makes it clear to all parties what is expected in order not to have an undue adverse effect on the character of the area. And require that new housing does not add greenhouse gas emissions. Today's buildings hopefully will last 100 years or more. In 50 or 100 years, housing built to today's standards will be seen as inefficient and wasteful of energy. We need our energy standards to anticipate the future. Our standards should not be less than best available practices, and better yet, new buildings should be real zero, not net zero. I suggest there be a cap on thermal loads. A housing unit with an area greater than a certain size would not be allowed to use more energy than building at the cap. I suggest 1,800 square feet as a starting point for discussion because that is an area already in S100. Now, in conclusion, The need for affordable housing must not preempt essential protections of our natural resources. We can vote. Needs amendments in order to vote. Thank you for listening to these comments. I ask that you find these recommendations persuasive and that you amend S100 as recommended.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Thank you for coming back, and thank you for sticking to time to help us with every other person. With that, I'd like to next,
So we have questions for,
Senator McDonald.
if we were to ban or to remove communities whose wastewater systems have had overflows from those places eligible to build housing with sewage treatment plants that are failing, how would we write, should we be careful to do in writing such a
I'm not suggesting removing those systems with the combined sewer overflows, or Burlington and Montpelier and Virgins and White River Junction and a lot of the big communities, Rutland. What I'm suggesting is that the priority for the wastewater infrastructure funding be directed, the first priority be directed to those communities, so that hopefully by the time, they get those 30,000 houses built, the combined sewer systems are separated and they're not generating more pollution overflows that way. And same with the older systems.
The question was not what hopefully would happen. How do we ensure that if we're going to build more than ones that are already failing, how do we deal with that part of it?
You either have to prevent it and say that, and I brought this up a couple of years ago and it was not well received, and I can understand that from a development housing point of view. So what I'm suggesting is acknowledging that there are problems with many of these municipal systems. They need a lot of work, and directing money to those municipal systems, perhaps to taking money out of some of the programs that are intended to expand systems in towns or create systems in towns that don't have them.
Thank you again, Mr. Weiss. Matt, I'd like to invite you to join us on the table. Mr. Tucker. Good morning.
Morning.
Good to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to see you. If I could, I'd like to give you guys a little bit of our, our work on housing and permitting and that sort of thing. Hi, good morning. Peter Tucker for the Vermont Association of Realtors. Really appreciate the opportunity to comment on S100 today, and and the work that this committee does. Our association, Vermont Association, represents over 1,800 members who work with property owners every day. We abide by a code of ethics and help Vermonters achieve the dream of home ownership. We have a government affairs committee, and it's charged with providing input on public policy. For the last 2 years, I've been working with the government affairs committee, and we have just exhausted, the discussion on housing. We have so many comments for you, but I only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to really keep it short and keep you on time if I can. Our government affairs committee includes our chair, Peter Fina, who is the actual chair of the planning commission in Jay, a builder, Graham Mink, who has done a tremendous amount of market rate rental housing in the city of Morristown, and others that are involved in policy creation. S100 really is designed to protect our natural resources by focusing development in areas where we want to see development: downtowns, village centers, and neighborhood development areas. Smart growth and infill development is the way to accomplish this. Graham Mink, who has done all this work in housing up in Morristown, told me at one point, he said, look, if I knew that I could avoid the Act 250 review in downtown's neighborhood development areas, that's the only place I'd ever built. that's protection to the environment that this bill offers. I know there are concerns about forest blocks, connected habitats, all the other stuff going on. But really, the incentive and the creation of these incentives is ultimately going to protect our natural resources. These even though those designation areas, there are 5 designation areas you discussed yesterday, even though they were really designed mostly for historic tax credits, they are the right place for development. We did a report on smart growth and zoning practices, provided funding for the Agency of Housing and Commerce to produce their booklet on it. And, and it's pretty clear that's where we want to incent development. We heard from the Natural Resources Board that most Act 50 permits go through, pretty much on time and, on schedule. Some get appealed. Most of them are minor, so they just get signed off on. But that's not the real challenge that Act 50 poses for developers. The challenge is really on whether or not to proceed with a project. And, we feel very strongly that that many developers will look at the risk of appeal. I mean, the cost of, of the planning and all that, but the risk of appeal and the fact that a project that starts out with one size ends up being significantly smaller really dramatically changes the financials on something like that. But really, our focus, and you see it in our brochure, and there is a part on municipal infrastructure, because we feel that that's going to be the basis for good quality development. But we really look at the 10-5-5 rule, and I really have one point to make here today. I'm going to let other folks make other points. And we identified this early on as probably the biggest impediment to small scale development mostly in our villages. There was a gentleman who testified in Senate Natural, built a 9-unit, I think it was a mixed use, so commercial on the first floor and residential on the upper floors. And it was a nice building, fit well into downtown Fairleigh. And then he had an opportunity to do a triplex on the other end of town. And his attorney said, look, don't do it. You're going to enter Act 250. You're going to have all of the requirements there. So this has been on our agenda for the last 2 years. And we just feel that it's really, really super important to look at it, mostly because, I mean, while municipal wastewater systems in the big cities can lead to development of rental housing and really add significantly to the housing needs that we have 247 towns. Most of them are small. A lot of this can occur not in a multi-story building, but rather 1 unit here, a couple of units there. We want to incent small developers to work in their communities, not to have to leave their community to find another place to operate. So we have one ask, and I will put it in an email to you, Senator Bray, and it's a period. In S100 on page 20, line 19, this is 10 VSA 6001 definitions. And small 3A, small item 4 says the construction of housing projects such as cooperatives, condominiums, or dwellings, the important one from our perspective, or construction of mobile home parks with 25 or more units. And we'd like to see a period at the end of units. And what does that do? That eliminates the 5-year, 5-mile portion of this legislation. I've tried to understand why 5 years and 5 miles makes such a big difference in the scheme of things. You can be concerned, that by boosting the number to 25, which this bill does, that it's too large a jump, especially if you reduce the number of years from 5 years to 1 year or to 0 years. But the reality is that some kind of increase is necessary. But to keep these guys going, and I'm not thinking about big builders, I guess the concern would be somebody does 25 units one year, 25 units, it just keeps going 25 at a time or 24, to avoid Act 250. But the reality is where we really think this is impactful is that little builder, Jonah from Fairleigh, building 9 units here and 2 units there and maybe a single family home. We sell real estate, realtors. And so our interest is in providing opportunities for folks to become homeowners. We understand the value of homeownership, the increase in value. If anyone doubted it, look at the last 2 years and the way housing prices have run up. Our personal wealth have probably gained more, certainly than the stock market lately, in terms of our ownership of properties. So that's really the ask. State can fund development through the creation of housing that we need. We need to encourage, or they cannot fund all of it through the housing. We just don't have enough dollars. What we can do is create incentives for private development to occur. When you do that, you want to keep it out of the woods. You want to keep it in compact and centralized development areas. And that's what this bill intends to do. Yesterday, you heard from a variety of parties who encouraged you to wait for the report to study the issue more thoroughly. Our message to you today is don't wait. We have historically underbuilt housing for the last decade, probably even longer than that. The way to do this is through thoughtful changes to environmental policy that create smart growth and infill development. And we feel very strongly that, we understand we have a housing crisis. This is the way to get headed in the right direction. Quite honestly, all of these programs take time. I mean, the programs that were passed last year are just being introduced right now, the missing middle, things of that nature. So in the next year, should this bill pass, or when this bill passes, I should say, sorry about that, because I believe in it, we really, it's going to take time for programs to get going, for developers to start to work in these towns and villages. And you'll have your reports and you'll be able to tweak things and modify as you go forward. So really appreciate the time to meet with you. I know you're on a tight schedule. Happy to answer any questions.
Senator McDonald?
What's the realtor's policy on notifying homeowners that if they buy the house, their house contributes to a sewage treatment center that overflows?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
When you sell homes,
yes,
do you disclose to owners? A couple of municipalities were mentioned earlier where there are frequent sewage treatment overflows.
Oh, I see.
What's your policy of notifying the homeowners that they're now about to buy a house and they build first and repair later town? So how do you communicate that?
I'm not, in terms of, so we're selling a piece of land and somebody's building.
So you're selling a home to someone.
A home that's already hooked up to municipal. Got it. Okay. I think that our obligation is to say, this is hooked up to a municipal system. And, so when we have private leach fields, we're doing testing and that sort of thing. But on a municipal system, I think the disclosure that it's hooked up there would be the extent of our responsibility. I think whatever's, most municipalities are managing their systems daily. So, yeah.
My question goes to the municipalities whose systems routinely fail for big water events.
Mm-hmm.
How do you communicate to your prospective buyers that the house you're trying to sell them is in a community that has a system that frequently fails, which presumably we'll all believe that sometime in the near future it's going to be repaired and won't happen again? How do you communicate that?
Yep. It would just be, it is not a requirement. I think the requirement is to say you're hooked up to the municipal system. I'm trying to think at the time of closing, what people would receive in terms of, of
from
that.
the people that you represent,
mm-hmm.
What is their policy? And you mentioned a code of ethics or whatever. What are they obliged when they deal with the code of ethics
mm-hmm.
to disclose to their buyers?
Right, that it's hooked up to a municipal system.
And if the municipal system is a reputation for repeated frequent failures, is that they were required to communicate
I
that?
think that's the responsibility of the municipality.
So you don't notify them of that as members of
That's
your
correct,
organization?
yes.
So it's kind of a buyer beware situation.
You know, buyer's effluent flows into the pipe. The results of where that goes is something different than their obligation to the city, to the, you know, right? I mean,
I think your answers are clear on how
good,
your people represent these things. Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Tucker.
awesome, thank you, nice to see everyone.
Madam Clerk,
Here.
is it, maybe you want one day?
One day.
That's the voting machine first. Okay, with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Horn to the table. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's my first time in this committee, but I do believe I've met everyone before.
First time this year, I guess, this.
First time this year,
Otherwise, you're a
exactly.
frequent flyer.
First time this session, yeah, yeah. So you've heard a lot about S100 in the last couple of days. You've heard that housing is an immediate and enormous crisis. It affects all income levels. And every currently sitting legislator promised to resolve the housing issue in their campaigns. We've all been complicit in creating the crisis, and we all need to make changes now that allow for development of housing at all income levels. The Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs Committee took that charge seriously. And when they voted out S100 last week, they had done a really deep dive on sort of all the issues that are in this bill. That is the only bill really that they've worked on thus far in this session. They understand, as you've also heard, that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights established that housing is a human right. The Vermont Housing Finance Agency, who I see is here today, has identified a need for 40,000 additional housing units. The question is, where are they going to be built? How many housing units have not been built because zoning permits were appealed or projects were sized to avoid Act 250 jurisdiction? Those are lost homes. When housing projects are scaled back, the financing becomes more difficult and in some cases impossible. How many units have been lost because developers could not afford to build them because the scale was not available to them? I want to talk a little bit about towns because clearly we're a core part of this piece of legislation. Land use planning and permitting are core responsibilities that voters in more than 253 cities, towns, and villages, that's why it's 253, not 257, have granted to their municipal governments. 253 of those municipalities have municipal plans that are adopted. 207 municipalities have adopted zoning or subdivision bylaws. There are 98 municipalities that have received municipal planning grants or bylaw modernization grants in the last 2 years to update their bylaws to accommodate housing development and redevelopment. The work is being done today. We believe that encouraging towns to continue that work and providing flexibility will be more effective in providing housing than one-size-fits-all zoning mandates in state law. We did discuss this with the committee, and you heard Chip Sawyer and Alex Weinhagen speak eloquently to that issue yesterday. In Vermont, and I think this is also very important because we've had a lot of discussion around this issue, the Downtown Development Board has approved designated areas for growth and infill that comprise 41 of Vermont's 9,600 square miles. Those 41 square miles include village centers, many of which do not have water or wastewater supply, water supply or wastewater services. This is not a lot of already occupied land to wedge 40,000 housing units into. It will not come close to happening without Act 250 jurisdiction continues to apply in those designated areas. I wanted to just mention, again, because you've had the conversation, that we presented a map that was developed by the Trust for Public Lands in August of 2021 that represented the acreage that was conserved in Vermont already, and it's 1.7 million acres. That was in the context of H126 that's in the House. I think it's very clear that in Vermont, we're vigilant in protecting open space. It's a deeply held ethic, and we need to accord the same sense of responsibility toward housing. We do believe that the most transformative changes in S100 would be to eliminate the provision for any 10 people to appeal a zoning permit. You would still be able to appeal a zoning permit if you were a person owning title to the property, a host municipality, an adjoining municipality or solid waste district, a person in the immediate neighborhood who can demonstrate a physical or environmental impact on their interest, any department and administrative subdivision owning any existing property in the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. But the any 10 people, which is kind of a random standard, would not be part of the law anymore. You could eliminate appeals of zoning permits for housing in designated areas based on character of the area. So someone would not be able to bring an appeal saying that the character of the area was being destroyed or compromised. Establish that a person, I will send this to you. Establish that a person appealing the zoning permit decision should not be able to appeal so as to reduce the number of units below the number of units allowed in the district. Eliminate Act 250 jurisdiction for priority projects. Increase the number of units that can be built before Act 250 is triggered. And eliminate altogether the language in Act 250 that establishes jurisdiction based on construction of housing projects within a radius of 5 miles and 5 years by a person. And there's a couple of sections where that, that language appears in Act 250. And then establish an enhanced designation process for municipalities to incorporate Act 250 criteria in the local zoning permitting process, so that there's only one level of review and one permitting process for projects to go through. And then eliminate the Agency of Natural Resources duplicative permitting of connections to wastewater and water supply. Municipalities own, operate, maintain, and their users pay for infrastructure investments. They're the ones that permit connections to those systems today. And the current duplicative system adds no value and costs developers both dollars and time. And actually, my recollection is that the Senate has passed this language in the previous sessions.
More than once.
More, I do believe more than once, yeah. And then I'm sure I'm the only person that's going to mention this one, but require property owners to disclose when they're selling property located on a Class 4 road or legal trail, and that the town is not obligated to maintain the road or trail. There's lots of instances around the state now where people have moved in, bought property on Class 4 roads or legal trails, built their beautiful houses, and then said, so why doesn't the school bus come up here? Like, you're not plowing the road, what's the deal? And that's maybe understandable if you move from far away, but there needs to be information about that. And then finally, I have to say that we are very concerned about subsection H that would prohibit towns from, I think it's section 6, I'll get you the right section, that would prohibit towns from regulating hotels or penalizing hotels for renting rooms to provide housing assistance through the General Assistance Program. They're not state staff or support services for the many needs of those who are receiving that particular housing assistance. As a result, municipal police, fire, and emergency medical service providers are severely strained and exhausted, as they're the people on the ground who have to respond to calls, and there are hundreds of calls. It's a different situation with emergency shelters, which do have wraparound services and are generally staffed 24/7. And with respect to the emergency shelter language, which is also in the limitations section, we recommend that you actually state in the statute that emergency shelters will have wraparound support services to meet the needs of those who use the emergency shelters, so that it's not wide open. And we're happy to talk about any of these issues, but I have a couple. I would just mention that you may have remember that Jeff Wenberg came in here for many years discussing the issue of combined sewer overflows and municipal connections. And some projects, some wastewater facilities are actually designed to overflow in extreme situations. We're working statewide to address that and change the incidence of those overflows and the severity of overflows. But it's something that is actually going to take time. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
The hotel provision that you're talking about, emergency shelter provisions. Instead of looking at the bill, maybe you know, I don't remember, but do we define clearly in law what we mean by emergency shelter?
Well, no. So I had a conversation with the Department of Children's and Families about the definition that's in the bill, which they say, I'm trying to find my piece of paper now, can't. They say it's a HUD definition, but it's very, and they don't want to change it. So, and it's pretty wide open if you read the plain language. So what we suggested was that in the limitations section in Title 24, where you address emergency shelters, that you actually specify there that they be regulated by the Agency of Human Services, incorporate wraparound support services to meet the needs of those who use the emergency shelters. I'm not a legislative drafter, but I think that would clarify what you're talking about within the zoning context. And I would understand that in the general, Agency of Human Services statutes might want to change a HUD definition, but the HUD definition sounds pretty wide open.
Okay. So I've learned more about that. I'm guessing that some of the options of a HUD definition may be to create eligibility for funding or something.
I think the HUD definition is
Right.
around those purposes. The person I talked to Katerina Lasias about that, who's the assistant, I believe, to the commissioner.
Yeah.
Who's a new commissioner.
Great. So your testimony, you're submitted electronically.
Yeah, I will. I'll send it to you.
So we'll be sure to post that. Are there any questions for Ms. Horn? Thank you very much for coming in. Lynette?
And Mr. Chair,
Senator McDonald?
is what
I was
what do
surprised.
the towns that you represent development in their communities where their wastewater systems are overflowing and completely, how do they notify their residents?
Well, the Agency of Natural Resources has a process now, as you know, where every time there's an overflow, it's posted on the Agency of Natural Resources website. As I mentioned, there are a number of wastewater systems that were actually designed so that when there were extreme weather events, there would be overflows. They're not overflows of raw sewage, but there would be overflows. And the agency is working to to change those systems, to update those systems so that that is not a practice anymore. It's a long process. It's tremendously expensive. I think we're making more headway now because of the funding from ARPA and the Jobs Act, but there's a lot of work to be done.
So when development in your towns, how do you deal with that development if your town is a chronic sewage overflow town?
So I'm not an engineer, and I wish Jeff Lundberg would come back, but I think he's exhausted. The municipal wastewater systems, there are a lot of them, and you heard some yesterday, that have capacity. They have design capacity left. And so if we have design capacity left, we would issue a permit.
So that's not a chronic wastewater overflow town, if you have capacity left and it doesn't overflow
The two
today.
issues are separate. They're separate issues that you might approve a hookup. And I would say that the Agency of Natural Resources does not deny a permit when the municipality has approved it. The Agency of Natural Resources essentially takes the money and issues the permit as well. So I don't believe you've got an extra protection because the Agency of Natural Resources is also permitting those systems.
So do the towns that you represent routinely approve additional new construction when they fall into that category of chronic
If there's
sewage
yes,
overflows?
if there's design capacity, yes, they do.
There's design capacity, which is repeatedly demonstrating that they overflow raw sewage. They continue to issue permits?
That's not what it's demonstrating. We're not going to agree. I think maybe we should talk about this in the hall where we love to talk about all kinds of things.
Mr. Chair, it's being suggested that this problem is overflowing in order to be dealt with in the hall downstream. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that the difference is that the capacity is rated on ordinary dry flow conditions. And what you're talking about is a consequence of like heavy rain events. And so although it may not make sense, from your perspective, I think that's the way the engineering works. Is the capacity is measuring its dry flow, and CSO is a design feature of protecting the wastewater treatment facility. We have been eliminating CSO
There's been a lot of money
facilities,
put into it.
but it, as Warren said, it's expensive.
Pardon me?
I want you to know.
So before we go too far into effluent, so Senator McCormick, last question to you.
You did say earlier that it's not raw sewage that's overflowing, but now you said, or did I hear you wrong?
No, it's not raw sewage.
Ever. Raw sewage doesn't overflow?
What happens is it goes through, the sewage goes into the plant, there are heavy rain events or extreme weather events. What comes out is combined. What overflows is not raw sewage, it's combined, right?
What is the combination? What's in the combination?
It's got rainwater in it, essentially. And so you need to have somebody in.
So it's combined with.
Or maybe the city of
What is the
Montpelier.
rainwater combined with?
The rainwater is combined with sewage, so it's not full strength raw sewage,
All right, okay, but there is,
but there is sewage.
okay, and it is possible for a proposed development to be permitted by the municipality, understanding that raw sewage may.
Yes, because because the design capacity is something different, and as the chair said, based on dry weather, normal
Yeah,
weather
yeah.
situations. So
So,
I'm happy to come back and talk about this and bring people with me who are actually engineers and so forth.
I mean, S100 raises the question of what kind of development we're gonna have where. But the CSO situation is something that's come out of the last 60 years, or I think a lot of plants were built in the 50s and 60s. Some have been upgraded, some not. We're chipping away at the problem. Is, are we making progress fast enough? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. But I would rather not try to delve into that one too deeply when that's not the issue
Well,
in front of us.
except, Mr. Chairman, we're being asked to support a bill that removes Act 250 protection of the environment in certain cases, because we're told we don't need Act 250 because the towns can take care of it. And now we're getting testimony that the towns taking care of it can result in raw sewage being included in what's going into the waters of the state, for which we have trustees and we have people.
Yeah.
And that's okay because that's the way it's designed, is the way I understand it.
I think that's, it's a certain way that is the answer, and I would say we've worked on this issue for years in the building. There's some record level of money going into addressing those, making the investments to address those. But we haven't, this committee, no other committee, no one has said full stop, no more development until well, I should say no one. No one in the building that I've heard has said, we're gonna do a bill that says no development in the state of Vermont until all CSOs are eliminated. And the level of investment would be somewhat astronomical, so we are
Well, I'm not sure.
finding a
No
compromise.
one's saying that. You're saying perhaps there should be some standard for where it is now overflowing. It has been overflowing recently, not for everywhere in the state, only for those places. And we're looking where in the bill that problem is addressed.
Okay.
Those
So,
are the,
Senator Watson, and then we will have, I don't think, Ms. Horn can't represent the wastewater treatment facility industry or whatever. So let's not keep pinging her with questions about what the towns are doing on an engineering level, and go to Senator Watson, who has some firsthand experience managing a
do.
town with special events.
I have to wait.
Yes, well, so I'm happy to talk further also about CSOs and particularly the experience of Montpelier with that. And just for context, we have some combined sewer water overflow points that are pretty close to the water resource recovery facility, the wastewater treatment plant. So what that means is that anything that we build is gonna more or less flow through that point, where a lot of things would flow through that point. And so it is a problem, it's a separate problem. And if because the problem is gonna be there regardless of how many developments are on that location. Problem occurs when rainstorms happen and overflow the system, regardless of how much sewage is coming into it.
I remember working through the proportions. It was in something like diluted 5,000-fold was the number I remember coming up with for jets. So you say, well, no one is espousing having raw sewage going into water, but if the normal volume of the operating system is overwhelmed by something 5,000-fold, I think that was the ratio then. Maybe that's not right. I'm just recollecting it.
well, we are,
You wouldn't have a public septic system, period. You'd have to have entirely separate stormwater system, which we are doing in MS4 town. The challenge there is that what is carried to the waters of the state through an MS4 separated system has many things we wouldn't necessarily want to see going into our water. Mr. Wendrop's argument for years has been that sending, prior to the moment at which a CSO event becomes a CSO event, sending all the combined stormwater and wastewater through the treatment facility leads to much cleaner water being discharged from the facility, and that there's a big net gain for the state to have such a system. So that, now we're going into, anyway.
If I could
pause
just
there.
mention one other consideration, but if you prohibit the housing units in those places where combined sewer overflows occur, you are going to have housing units outside of designated areas on septic systems, which are only an individual's responsibility and might or might not fail. So there's no getting away from the sewage issue one way or the other.
And if you're in Addison County, that personal septic system will be probably a very
50,000 or something. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
so thank you. Just like waste, all forms of waste stir all sorts of interesting conversations. With that, I'd like to go to Mr. Leonard.
What a good transition.
Waste brings us all together always.
All actually, science. For the record, my name is Seth Leonard. I'm the Managing Director of Community Development at Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Prior to that, I also had experience in Winooski's water wastewater system as a former mayor, trying to balance the difficulties that municipalities face and meeting those needs of trying to see a community built out, but also make sure that you're doing it responsibly. Mr. Tucker referenced actually this project a little earlier. We didn't coordinate on that, but just a nice picture to start off. And just to, I know we're going last. And in baseball, going last usually means you're a pitcher, you're injured, or you're a utility infielder. But I think
Or you're batting cleanup.
Fourth or fifth usually, right? But I think our role and job here today is perhaps just to frame a bit back to the need that started the conversation for this bill. And the word crisis has been used a lot to discuss where Vermont's housing situation is. And we would agree that that's an appropriate word. And I think the important thing about crisis to recognize is that it's usually derived from long-standing decisions. It's not something that happened all of a sudden. We're not victims of something. And what I really appreciate about this legislation and proposal is trying to take a holistic approach to shifting our balance and getting the balance on priorities in the state correct. And what I'm excited about as I look around the state is above me is a picture of a setting in Waitsfield where the Mad River Valley Planning District held a housing coalition meeting that had over 230 people show up. I've been in housing now, I got a bald spot, I've been in housing now a long time. And 10 years ago, we would beg to have 3 people show up to a meeting about housing. 230 people show up. And it wasn't all shared perspectives and views, but people were talking about how do we as a community adapt? What do we need to do to build out our infrastructure? How can we keep our sense of who we are and where we are, but also add to our community? And when I go into these conversations and talk to communities about where they're at, a lot of what I think about our job role doing is showing a bit of a mirror and saying, this is where you are, this is who you are, is this where you want to be? And if this isn't where you want to be, what steps can we take from a policy perspective, and what investments can you make to get to the place where you want to be, to your goal? Right now, we're number 1 and number 2 in a couple areas where I think we need to be thoughtful about where our policy is leading us, right? So first off, this is where we are. We are the lowest vacancy rate state in the country. We have the tightest housing market by most measures in the country. We have the largest average lot size by a fair amount in the country. We are the 2nd or 3rd oldest state in the country, depending on when you look at that data and how you look at it. And this is at a time that by 2036, for the first time in the United States history, we'll have more people over the age of 65 than we have under the age of 18. That's not a scare tactic. That's to say that Vermont and Northern New England actually has a demographic crisis when it comes to that. If we're going to be competitive in the future as a state and sustainable from a population perspective, we'd better figure that out. And this has been discussed a lot, and this is some of a lot of the work that we do. We are the 2nd whitest state in the country as well. And that's in a nation where by 2041, the global majority will be our majority in the United States, right? So we will be in a majority minority country. And again, Northern New England issue and problem there when it comes to demographics. So from a population standpoint, this is where our current housing stock is leaving us. In terms of the age of the housing stock, that's been discussed quite a bit too. We had oldest by some measures, second oldest by some measures, housing stock in the nation. No one's got more pre-1939 homes from a percentage perspective than us, and this speaks to the aging stock that we have. And I think this is the chart that's probably gotten a lot of attention, maybe questions in this committee, has been referenced by a few other folks, which is when we run estimates and think about how many homes we need to house those who are homeless to get it to a normal vacancy rate where we can absorb additional people and people in Vermont can move around, and where the price dynamics of rental units aren't so, and home ownership units aren't so thrown off by a lack of supply that it's extreme detriment to our state. And when we think about who we need to add in order to balance those demographic goals that we should have as a state out, right? That's where we arrived at this number of 20 to 30,000, or 30 to 40,000, excuse me, additional homes being needed. On the higher end of that, the 40,000 is when we think about things from a pandemic era perspective, where we've seen more immigration into the state, we've seen more people added. So to break down what those numbers look like, you would be at 25% of that $40,000 or 40,000 unit number being needed just to stabilize our vacancy numbers, right? Just to get to a healthy vacancy rate of 5%. You need 6% of those units to house those who are experiencing homelessness in Vermont. Year over year, we've experienced a 7% increase in homeless households, Vermonters experiencing homelessness, I should say, in the state over the last couple of years. And then 8% would replace that old housing stock I showed that chart about, right? So 8% just to replace the units that are going offline that are no longer functional because of their age. And then you've got the 60% to say, this is the number needed to stabilize from a population standpoint, support those shift in inflow. If we continue to see the same interest in moving to Vermont that we've seen during the pandemic. And we had Kathy Beyer in earlier, and one thing I always appreciate when Kathy leads with is just development of housing is really hard to do. And I don't know how often that's been said in this committee during the session, but it's more challenging than ever before. I was talking to somebody who's worked in housing development for the last 40 years, who's retiring, and they just said, it's too hard for me. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm exhausted by it, right? And we're seeing those pressures come from a number of different places. From a national perspective, cost of development has been measured by some studies to have increased by 30%. In the state of Vermont, we've experienced a 36.2% increase in our development costs using our 9% tax credits as a bellwether in the development cost of housing over the last 4 years. In that same period, the federal resources, the largest federal resources we have to fund affordable housing and rental development has been decreased by 4.3%. So our resource base isn't keeping up with it, and we're under a lot of pressure there. And the leaps and bounds that we've taken in building what I would call the right buildings in the right place are incredible. Most of the public money that's spent goes into designated areas and sites housing that's extremely energy efficient, extremely environmentally conscientious, in places where we want people living from a transportation perspective, infrastructure perspective, and amenities perspective. But as we look towards a post-ARPA world where we do not have that large influx of federal funding, we're going to have to be really scrappy and work really hard to make things work. And I showed this graph last year when I was talking about the Missing Middle Homeownership Development Program. This is the way I think about the development cycle. Up at the top is usually what we're here to do, which is to really decry what the need for housing is in the state, to tell you this is what the most vulnerable Vermonters need in terms of resources for us to be able to build enough units to help people stay out of homelessness and have successful lives. And then we're arguing about the availability of capital. More recently with ARPA, we've had less pressures on that front. And when ARPA came, we had a real scramble as a development community because we did not have a large pipeline. We could not build the units necessary to send that money down if you snapped your fingers and said, go today, right? It took time. And that's because your development capacity is structured based off how much funding people think is available, number one. But then number two, what was spoken about earlier, it's about risk tolerance. Development and creation of housing is a timing game. And if there's unpredictable things in your path, you don't go for it, you don't do it, and it increases the cost tremendously. So it's not about the number of say disputes about any specific regulation that would be your measure of whether or not housing is getting built as a result, or that regulation is being detrimental to development. Talk to developers and builders about all the things they passed on that were opportunities that they could have taken. And that's a hard thing to do, but that's really what drives how large our pipeline is and the appetite to build more housing. And I like it when people give me ideas about stuff to read or up on. If you have a chance, Paul Searles of Northern Vermont University does just an incredible job, I think, talking about our culture of development and the way Vermont's thought about land use regulation in relation to homes and housing over history. And it's very specific. It's not a book written by somebody from somewhere else about it. Paul does an incredible job of doing, really creating a picture of that. And then from a zoning perspective nationally, I also just want to call out, and again, this isn't a fear tactic, it's just there's more pressure now from the federal government for states to do this type of work when it comes to land use regulation conversations. And increasing the White House has indicated, we're going to start pressing on looking at what states are doing from a land use and regulation modernization standpoint and tie that to HUD funding. So we haven't seen that expressed, but Sarah Bronin, who we had at our conference as a speaker as part of the National Zoning Atlas effort, has been spending a lot of time there. So we expect that to be an increased perspective from the federal government as well. And with that, we'll do any questions.
Can you say a little more about the current funding and how it may be constrained if we don't make changes? That can you just be a little more blunt about it? Like, what would we need to do to remain eligible, or what are we not doing that, as best you can sort of foresee, might make us ineligible?
We don't know what the answer to that is, but I know a component of this is to work on creating zoning laws. We're already actively working with Department of Housing and Community Development and other partners to do that. We've got a project team and they're starting to make progress on that. We actually don't know what the federal rules could end up being. It was just in a very broad housing policy platform put out by the White House. That was a recommendation that then sends their staff into thinking about how do we implement this and what strings could we tie to looking at those issues. I think what's exciting about the zoning atlas and those types of conversations is the ability to measure progress over time in terms of what we're allowing. Desegregate Connecticut's been a real leader on that if you're looking for an example of what that looks like.
Thank you. Any committee questions for Mr. Leonard? Senator McDonald?
Thank you very much for your opening, which we should probably listen to several times because it helps answer the questions that we need to have answered before we decide what our goals are. But when you dealt with the demographics today are different than they were 20 years ago. So is the federal support different today than it was 20 years ago. But if we, the state government, need to help buy homes. That's one of the questions. And who do we wish to add? We talk about adding young people to change their demographic, but are we designing our housing plans to attract young people? I got redistricted this year, which gave me license to ask homeowner after homeowner after homeowner, hundreds. Oh, how long have you lived here in this house? What prompted you to move to Bradford or Fairleigh? They didn't know me and I didn't know them. And if the answers were interesting, we wanted to, most of them were climate issues. Most of it was too dry, too much fires, etc. And occasionally it was we're getting away from people that from culture wars. They had specific examples, but the way our children are treated, the way which our ancestry is treated. But we don't seem to advance the housing with keeping in mind, who the customers are. Folks I've spoken to that, 1, 2, 3, 4 houses in a row in some places out on back roads from Washington State, Texas, California, Florida. And they were older people.
Yeah.
Older people, not younger people. And they're buying up the houses that younger people would have purchased in another time.
Might I give an example about that playing out that's very specific? In San Bryce District, Madison County, in Virginia, there's a development called Claybrook, and I know the builder wouldn't mind me telling the story. When it was set out and he wanted to build a neighborhood for families, he thought, this is within walking distance of downtown and restaurants and all the things that I think families would love to live in. And his goal as a builder was not to make the biggest profit margin he could. He wanted to see a community built. And when he started selling those homes, he was in the 3s. He's now finishing the last home 4 years later, and he's in the 6s and 7s. And the people who started out buying those homes are not the same people who were able to buy the last homes that he started to build as a result of those types of pressures that you're speaking to. And it's been very frustrating for him. It wouldn't mind me saying his name's Peter Kahn in Claybrook Development in Virginia, if you want a good story about how that's played out. Yeah.
So, Mr. Chair, I feel like I'm asking a non-question question.
That's never happened before.
But what I see going on is we're worried about where young people are going to live and people with less incomes, and we're trying to put them into a compactor and squeeze them into the downtowns. That seems to be what's going on. Meanwhile, outside of town, people with plenty of resources are pretty much unfettered in building multiple driveways up hillsides, causing erosion and whatever, going through game trails left and right, looking for views, finding those views, and then they don't have a problem in finding builders. Because for some strange reason, whenever the door opens in the morning for people seeking to hire builders, they always pick the customers that have the most money.
Yeah.
And then they leave the state or the federal government to run around after those that are going to be compacted and put into compact downtowns, regardless of whether the downtowns can handle their sewage or not, in spite of the state and the federal government's recent having gotten out of the business of providing help for municipalities for sewage treatment stuff. That's what's going on, and I don't see housing bill. We recognize that that's what's going on. We're blinders on to the things that are happening detrimental in this rush to compact as many folks and put them downtown, and it's creating a new demographic. That's not my question. That's my comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator Wood.
Thank you, Chair Bray. And actually, your point falls very similarly into mine, Senator McDonald, which is I actually think the bill does the opposite of that, which is currently we are, from my understanding, it is easier for wealthy people to build large homes in Vermont. What is very difficult is for my generation, who doesn't necessarily, by the numbers, want a large multi-bedroom home. Instead, we are more likely to live alone. We're more likely to want smaller homes. We're more likely to want walkable downtowns. All of that development is what we want to create an opportunity for. So that was why I asked the commissioner when he was here about the idea of like cramming the low-income people into the downtowns and allowing the continued growth of wealthy folks in the hillside. And he provided me with comfort that that's not an issue that is being exacerbated by this bill, but in fact lessened by this bill. I also see when I talk to constituents who have moved into the downtowns in Windsor County, like White River Junction, it actually is a lot of older folks who want to be able to be on they want to not drive everywhere, or they're unable to drive everywhere. So I actually see this bill as responding to part of the concern that you have. And the sewer wastewater aspect is something we should probably spend some more time on, but I do feel like in the majority of communities with designated downtowns that they're having very robust conversations about the capacity of their water and sewer, at least in Windsor County. So
If I could just add one thing, there are two financial components that we're big fans of that try to support that, which is the rental revolving loan fund and the missing middle home ownership piece of it. The whole goal of those is to be more dexterous tools that allow for some infill building in smaller communities that don't require developers in each case to have to use extremely complex federal programs that only typically work at scale. So it's that John Richard project that showed the 8 to 13 unit stuff that is in good places to live that is also infill.
yeah, infill is a good word.
Yeah.
There's, I live next door to Bristol Co-housing, which I'm not sure I have the numbers exactly right, but it was started out with 2 big houses on a very large lot. And it was redeveloped. Now I think 17, there's 17 units in there. And you would hardly know that things have changed. It's like a small green sort of out in the back with smaller units around it. Things have been divided up. Infill development, and most of the people have come are, I would say, older, because Senator McDonald's, coming, and quite a few have come from away. They thought Vermont was a very attractive place for lots of reasons. They all have their own reasons, but they've settled in Bristol, and every time I talk to them, they, for the most part, they seem very happy they moved here. So, with that, thank you for batting cleanup. 3-bagger. And with that, we will go on break till 10:45, at which point we will return to S5, the Affordable Heat Act, and we'll review as a committee the proposal amendment from appropriations and then take a committee vote on that prior to going to the floor today. So we have about a 25-minute break until Mr. Kowski is available, and we'll start on that work.
General, do you want a committee vote on which?
On the Senate appropriations proposal of amendment to